I'm here in Gateshead on the south bank of the River Tyne for the opening of one of the most exciting centres of contemporary art in the country, Baltic, an abandoned flour mill given a new lease of life as a factory for art. There are 5 floors, each spanning the entire length of the building, and each with a stunning view out across the dramatic cityscape. Art colonises every conceivable corner of the building, from walls to floors to windows, and with the emphasis on experimentation. There's an extensive and radical artist-in-residency programme alongside the more traditional galleries. Baltic also has an international perspective, with artists from Cuba, Japan, America and Europe working and exhibiting alongside each other in over 3,500 square metres of pristine, flexible gallery space. Baltic wants to be at the heart of the cultural regeneration of the North East, a regional arts centre with world-class aspirations, which have developed over the last few years. Verity Sharp looks at how it all began.
Once home to Britain's biggest shipyards, Gateshead and Newcastle Quayside is now in the middle of a multi-million-pound regeneration project. It includes what may come to be recognised as some of the century's finest architecture, like the new Gateshead Music Centre, due to be completed in 2004, and the award-winning Millennium Bridge. It's come a long way from the grim landscape of the mid-1980s, when Tyneside was in the grip of a recession. As the traditional industries continued to decline, a lot of thought had to go into what was going to replace them. Art might not have seemed a likely saviour, and a lot of work had to be done first to change people's attitudes. But attitudes did change, thanks to this. With its wingspan bigger than a jumbo jet's, Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North. Once ridiculed as the Gateshead Flasher, today it's a cultural icon for the North East and arguably Britain's most famous piece of public art.
We had a vision to use art and put it into the public domain. And we only have the one gallery in Gateshead, and it's a huge rural area as well as a town. And we thought, well, we would take art to the public.
The success of the Angel proved that art could work. Its installation has heralded the start of a new creative era, and it symbolises the cultural renaissance of the North East.
Obviously, the old industries have gone, and I don't see them coming back, mining and shipbuilding and engineering and so on. And something's got to replace them. And certainly there's been a shift in my lifetime away from heavy industries to light industries and to leisure activities. The arts certainly will replace some of the jobs that have disappeared in the coal mining and so on, in the heavy industries. And that is the way forward.
The North East has a proud musical tradition, but it's never had a suitable venue. With the single most expensive element of the Quayside Regeneration Project, that is about to change. When completed, Norman Foster's £120 million giant steel and glass music centre will be a world-class concert hall, catering for all musical tastes, from pop to classical, from folk to jazz. It'll also provide a permanent home to one of Europe's finest chamber orchestras, the Northern Symphonia. The opening of Baltic Art Gallery epitomises the changes going on here. A former flour mill, it was designed in the 1930s, built in the 1950s, abandoned by the 1980s. In its heyday, it employed 400 people who processed imported wheat from as far afield as South America and Australia. Yep. Witness to the mill's rise and fall was laboratory technician Bill Adams.
That's me there with the spectacles on it beside all my laboratory stuff. You can see by that it was quite a community, and there was a happy spirit amongst everybody, even though we were all being made redundant.
After 8 years of hard work, the project's architects have transformed the derelict industrial building from a dark windowless cube into a high-tech art gallery.
At the time it was a solid brick box, so there were several ways that you could bring light in, and we thought very simply, if you took out the east and west facade, in fact the west is what you see here, that would be one good way of getting in the light whilst maintaining solidity of the building with the north and south onto the river. and also then the east, which is behind, bringing light into the galleries that way. And then at the roof, providing a rooftop space that could also allow light in through the top level into the high gallery.
The gallery hopes to attract art lovers from all over Europe to an area not normally associated with cultural tourism.
What we can be a flag. I mean, we can really say that this is an interesting place, an interesting part of the world, and why don't you just come here? And so I think it can stimulate businesses, but first of all, of course, it should also bring experiences to people here and wonderful, wonderful art to look at.
By developing an independent arts agenda, Sune Nordgren aims to open up Baltic to influences from Europe and beyond.
What I've said is that we will never take an exhibition from London, and it's a kind of a proudness, I think, which is very necessary. Because as I see it as a foreigner, England is probably the most centralized art scene in Europe now. But since we are furthest away from London that you can be in England, if we start pulling from here, we probably can change it.
Already, the arrival of Baltic is having an impact on the region's artistic community, with locally based artists excited by its potential.
Lots of artists are staying in Newcastle after having graduated from the two universities here, or from Sunderland, and looking at the Baltic to be that perhaps flagship, like the Tate in Liverpool or St Ives, for people to congregate around.
It's up to us to benefit from the new audience. As artists, I guess we're looking forward to being able to see, more art on our doorstep. I hope that we will have the confidence, I'm sure we will, to propose projects to Baltic. I think they're going to have a lot of people knocking on their door.
250,000 visitors are expected here every year. There'll be no permanent collection, so people will find something new every 4 weeks.
My ambition is to make this a place that you want to come back to, so that the people in the region will feel that this is my place. I can always go to the Baltics. There's always something new that's happening and something interesting to see. I don't really need to know the program. I have a confidence in that this place will provide me with some nice and challenging and interesting experiences. I think this is a place for regional people, first of all, but it will provide first-class international experiences.
The surge of creative enterprise on the quayside is fuelled by the decision from both sides of the Tyne to mount a joint bid to be European Capital of Culture in 2008. The £450 million Newcastle Gateshead initiative has been strengthened by the successful regeneration of the area, and many consider the Twin Cities to be Britain's strongest contenders. This once derelict quayside is now flowering, thanks to the dramatic transformation of an old building.
It was actually a silo building, so the flour went through the building, and so it was a process. It was a storage of flour, and then the flour moved on. And in a sense, we've kind of kept that function. Instead of flour, we've got art.
I'm rather pleased to find that I can come back and see a building now that I didn't think much of in the first instance. But now you can come back and see it, and it's a real picture.
It certainly is a pretty picture. Kick-started, as we've just heard, by a sculpture that was put here 4 years ago, the Angel of the North. The man responsible for which, Anthony Gormley, joins me now. Anthony, I suppose it's overstating the case to say that you single-handedly kick-started the Renaissance, but a lot of people up here do say that work gave a huge impetus. You must be very proud and see this as some kind of legacy, I suppose.
I don't know about a legacy. It's a continuation of an incredibly bold series of acts of patronage and confidence that somehow culture and contemporary culture can make the difference.
When you first came here, was there any feeling of resistance? That's how it's painted in the press, but I've never heard your side of the story. Did you find people had this
You
great
mean about
work?
the Angel or about this place?
About the Angel first.
The Angel was hated as an idea. There were 7,000 signatures, stop the sculpture, collected in the Metro Centre and other places of commercial exchange in Gateshead. And no, it was truly hated. And even while we were making it, it was hated. And then once it got there, things began to change. And then, as we know, the arrival of the shearer shirt was its baptism, and the rest is history, really.
I love that idea, that people putting a shirt on your sculpture, that kind of integrated into the community. Perhaps the Japanese artist who's put a sculpture of a bread head on the side of the building will do something similar for the Baltic. Maybe the Baltic doesn't need it now. What's your reading of this building and this whole project? Is it something to be very excited about, or is it just another regional arts centre?
I think it's something to be enormously excited about. For the first time, we have an institution that is entirely dedicated to new work and is itself, I mean, there are 5 studios in there, is itself a birthplace of new work. And in a way, it has none of the conservative aspects of, in a way, the museum that has a determined value to its collection. This is a huge vote of confidence in contemporary culture and the fact that we can make things that in some way have only relevance to the future. And it's a wonderful building. It's been transformed in a way so totally different to Tate Modern that it's breathtaking. The fact that you see light right through the building from the west to the east side on every single floor.
You said as the sun sinks.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, isn't it? This is the most perfect moment to be here, actually. And this isn't like the north, is it? This is not our vision of the north. People quietly walking up and down the riverside, enjoying the incredibly clear air and blue sky. It's fantastic, isn't it?
I don't want to put a down on things, but recently you led a campaign, you took a letter to Downing Street complaining about the funding of regional museums. Now, perhaps there's a different issue because you were talking about permanent collections and this doesn't have one. But I wonder whether you think, in the current political and artistic climate, whether a place like the Baltic will be funded properly and whether it will be able to survive in the current situation.
I think that the answer to that question depends on 2 things. One is the will of Gateshead Council, and the other really is whether people are going to be intrigued about what happens on the inside of this building. It's a very strong symbol already, the building itself. It's a huge mass that has, in a way, been part of the Newcastle Gateshead skyline for a long time. But it's now being put to a very different use. And I think the fact is that people will be intrigued about what's cooking in there and will want to continually come and see the new shows. I think that the future of the Baltic is a rosy one.
Absolutely. Now, the key thing, though, tonight, to begin with, is celebrating the opening of this building. It's a phenomenal building, and I think it's time that we went in to look at it. And earlier, I went round on a little preview tour with the architectural critic, Raymond Ryan.
So here we are in the entrance pavilion to Baltic. We've just come off the Millennium Footbridge by Wilkinson Eyre, come through the new square, and this is the only new visible construction, I guess.
It's like a tunnel, isn't it?
It's like a tunnel, yes. You come through from the outdoor space, from the light, if you like, in through this much lower space. And then here, in the gap between the pavilion and Baltic itself, there's this area open to the sky, so the light floods in.
So you're looking upwards in anticipation of that which is to happen.
Exactly. It's almost like a kind of Celtic tomb. You come through the tunnel, and then we get this view.
What about the material? Because there's a lot of contemporary material, but then there's this rough natural feel and rusted industrial material. And that could be a mishmash. How does it work, do you think?
Well, I guess they've tried to limit the palette to 4 or 5 essential elements. The floor here on the ground floor is, I think it's Festinial slate, very elegant stone surface.
But not over-polished, which makes it rough. And
it has a kind of industrial feel to it at the same time. And of course it's laid in a geometric pattern, so it feels quite contemporary, I would say. And then these walls are Corten steel, which is a steel that was developed in the 50s in America. It's allowed to oxidize slightly. That means that at a certain stage it won't rust any further.
But does it give an impression of an industrial age faded, or is that an overreading?
No, not faded. I think a slightly romantic idea, perhaps, of the industrial age.
So the whole thing's fluid but anticipatory, so let's get
That's
in.
right.
Okay. Now, these are the offices, and actually this is the part of a building that's usually tucked away. But here, they're bang in the middle, and there's a dramatic plunging view off a balcony that goes straight down into an art gallery, so that, in fact, the public are aware of people working up here, and the people working up here are aware of the public and the art itself down there.
That's right.
That's pretty dangerous and risky. Do you think it works?
That's pretty unusual. I guess this goes back to the idea of the institution as a kind of factory or as a laboratory. That's to say that everybody who's working here, whether they're secretarial or curatorial, is in a sense on view. And not only can you see them as a visitor, but they can see you as a visitor as well.
So it's looking at that kind of industrial, the industrial function of this building.
Yes.
Now, Raymond, your idea about cities using art galleries as a form of competition, I think is quite nicely reciprocal here, because probably the most stunning symbol of this region is the Tyne Bridge, linking Newcastle on the right-hand side to Gateshead on the left.
Yes.
And that's fully integrated into this building. It's beautifully framed.
Yes, well, you can see that the whole west wall of the old flour mill has been removed, and in its place is this glazed insertion. The elevators are in glazed boxes, so we can look out to the west, out towards these bridges, so that the traffic, and if you like, the day-to-day traffic of the city becomes part of the spectacle of the interior of the gallery.
Now, the feeling here is a little bit more sacred. This is more like the cathedral space to me, because it's slightly darkened. And it's probably because there are drawings on the wall, as well as these extraordinary gongs by the Catalan artist Jaume Plensa. We're quite tucked in, though, here.
Yes. Well, it's one of several spaces that span this very large space, stacked one above the other. So below we have the administrative mezzanine. Here we're in this Plensa space. And above us is the double-height space currently used for the Chris Burden show.
So there's a kind of contradiction here of both things being constricted and yet flexible at the same time.
Well, I think it's about trying to make spaces that feel dedicated to particular works of art. So, as you say, here they can close off these views out towards the bridge. So, although in general one is conscious of the city around us, also they want to be able to focus in on particular works of art, so we aren't too distracted by the exterior world.
Yeah, sometimes there's a feeling in spaces like this that art has to compete with the view outside. It doesn't have to compete with the Tyne Bridge, but there is an interesting view out eastwards.
Yes, towards the sea.
Yeah, well, you see one of the old kind of icons, if you like, of modernist housing.
That's right.
The biker.
The biker by Ralph Erskine, yes, from the early 70s.
But, however dramatic that is, I think this is one of the most effective installations in the gallery because it's interactive, and the public who have walked around a beautiful, pristine space and have been apart from the works of art here, they can actually engage with it.
That's right.
Which I'm going to do. I've been desperate to do this since I walked into the gallery.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
Ready?
Okay. Now, Raymond, Ryan and I have reached the top of the building, and we've been joined by the director of the Design Museum, Alice Rawsthorne. Alice, this is a restaurant. It gets prime position. I suppose that's inevitable in today's contemporary museum climate.
Well, in terms of the financial reality of museum running, yes, it probably is inevitable, because I imagine that the Baltic will be financially very dependent on the revenue generated by this restaurant. That said, the restaurant makes the most of the pole position in the building. Like the rest of the building, it absolutely makes the most of the Newcastle skyline, because all the views out of the Baltic over the city are really breathtaking, I mean, even including the loos, which have a vertiginous floor-to-ceiling glass window, so you have a fabulous view over rural Gateshead behind us. But actually, this is a very clever piece of positioning within the building, because beneath us is the most glamorous gallery in the Baltic. It's a fourth-floor gallery with a Chris Burden installation, and there are fantastic sort of glazed rivulets running on either side of the roof. So you really do feel when you're in there that you're absolutely at the top of the building, but actually this restaurant has been tucked rather neatly on top between the two rivulets of glass.
Now that space is the big space. That's double height. It's exactly double the third floor that we've just been into. And I'm impressed with it, but one of the things I was expecting in a museum like this is a massive cavernous space that is very dramatic and can have large-scale installations. Is that slightly disappointing?
It is perhaps slightly disappointing. Maybe it's too cliched of us always to expect large cavernous spaces, and certainly that's something that Tate Modern has very much engendered within us. Instead, here you have a variety of spaces. It's quite a squat building, and I do wonder about the degree to which the architect Dominic Williams was constrained by having to sort of design within the footprint of the building that was already here, because of course that was built as a flour mill, and I can't imagine that Rank Hovis McDoodle had any expectation it would ever be turned into art galleries when they put it up. And so with the exception of the 4th floor, it is perhaps a slightly squatter art space than you would expect.
Raymond, we've been looking at how the building itself works, and this idea of industrial production keeps coming over and over again. So I get the feeling that you're not so bothered about the constraints of having what was a flour mill. In fact, that's something the architect can work with.
Well, I read it more as a studio, as a series of studios, rather than a traditional museum. So unlike, let's say, Tate Modern, or indeed the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which has those very theatrical, in the case of Bilbao, or the Baroque public spaces, this plays down the nature of public space, I would say. In fact, one might say that perhaps the square outside and the footbridge are, in a sense, the public space. And then when we come into the building, it's a series of quite practical spaces, I would say. The Chris Burden space is a dramatic space. There's no denying that, I don't think. But it isn't perhaps the grand hall that one knows from 19th century museums.
I think you have to think in terms of the Kunsthalle model, the sort of Middle European art galleries rather than museums, because undoubtedly that was the concept, the role model that inspired the Baltic. And so in a sense, our notion of having art galleries with sort of huge cavernous vaulted galleries for large-scale installations isn't necessarily relevant here. One of the nicest things about the Baltic conceptually are the studios and workrooms for the artists, the sense that this will be a place where art isn't simply displayed, it's actually created. And so the artists are given the means and the resources to live and work here and further their work.
How realistic, though, do we think the chances of a creative impetus coming to this part of the country, stemming specifically from the Baltic? Or does art actually come from what artists do, and museums like this can only in the end reflect what's going on around it rather than generate it?
Well, art does primarily come from what artists do, but it really doesn't matter whether a building like this is in Gateshead, it's in Florence, it's in Frankfurt, it's in Milwaukee, wherever, because artists do show internationally, and I suspect that foreign artists in particular would be, because they are used to the Kunsthalle model of having lots of regional cities in Germany, all of which have Kunsthalles of very high stature, they would perhaps be less discriminating against the sort of London-Newcastle divide maybe than Brits will be. And the fact that the Baltic is actually offering resources to the artists who'll come and work here will be a big draw.
All museums talk about dealing with a local or regional audience, but how realistic is it to expect this one to be able to engage a regional audience?
Well, there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't engage a regional audience. The Lowry Centre in Manchester is phenomenally popular. Look at the success of the Sainsbury Centre at UEA in Norwich. There's always been a vibrant culture in Newcastle and Gateshead. We've got Time TV Studios, home of the Tube, in the 80s over there. We've got the multi-storey car park where Michael Caine careered his car around in Get Carter in the 70s, over in Gateshead. Newcastle's a fantastic city, culturally very, very vibrant. So there's absolutely no reason why the Baltic shouldn't tap into that.
But I get the feeling that the programme is aimed at a more international arts audience, which I don't know necessarily is a good thing or a bad thing. It just seems to be what happens when curators decide to organise programmes that come from their own particular agendas, but also which vehemently does not take shows from London, which this place has said explicitly it won't do.
But that question seems to presuppose that the people of the North East don't want international art, and I suspect strongly that they do. I mean, one of the great things about the opening programme is that Jane and Louise Wilson, who were born and brought up in Newcastle, are represented here with Chris Burden and Carsten Holler, international artists of huge reputation. Given that the Kunsthalles have worked so successfully, admittedly with huge local government subsidies, in Germany and other parts of Europe like Switzerland, there really isn't any reason why a world-class contemporary art gallery shouldn't work here in Gateshead.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's absolutely spot on. Then, nonetheless, there is always this pressure to involve local or regional artists. Mm-hmm. Is that viable? Should that happen? I think
it's absolutely viable. And the fact that we have the artists, there is this artist in residence program, means that people, including, hope, young artists will come and see work being made by artists of a very high quality, and there should be an infusion, a cross-fertilization between the international and the local. I think that's very much the way that other countries are developing.
Well, youth is certainly being celebrated here in the biggest way possible creatively because of the architect, because of Dominic Williams, who came into this project, I mean, out of the blue almost. People hadn't really heard anything about it.
Well, he hadn't actually built anything before, and I suspect nobody was more surprised than him when he actually won the competition. This is one of the sort of very rare examples of a genuinely open architectural competition. He entered the competition about 8 years ago, and he was then a junior architect with Skidmore, Owings, Merrill. He literally sent in a submission from his back bedroom, went through to the second stage, had no resources because he didn't have an architectural practice or a studio with which to prepare for the second stage of the competition. Luckily for him, by pure coincidence, his father was an architect, so his practice, Ellis Williams, did actually have an infrastructure that Dominic Williams could draw on. He eventually won the competition, so this is his first building.
It's his big break as well. I mean, have we got a major talent in the making?
Well, we have to see. This certainly has put him on the national map and maybe a European map as well. It's a little bit like you know, the second album scenario. We have to see what the next big project will bring.
Well, we wait for its release. Raymond Ryan, Alice Rawson, thank you both. Okay, so that's the architectural tour, but of course the crucial thing is what actually happens inside the building. And now I'm joined by two of the artists who are taking part in the opening exhibition here at Baltic, who also happen to be Newcastle born, Jane and Louise Wilson. Your piece, Dreamtime, is based loosely, or very directly actually I should say, on a space rocket launching somewhere in Kazakhstan.
That's right. It was filmed in October 2001, and it was, well, I suppose basically it was sort of a document of a real event, which was obviously the launch of the first manned space mission to the International Space Station. And we filmed there over a 3-day period, and it was filmed in a cosmodrome called Baikonur in the south part of Kazakhstan.
So it's part of this continuing exploration you've had of large institutions of power, but in this instance, you're moving out of buildings and the sky's the limit, I think we could say.
I think it's also interesting as well because it again comes back to those ideas of borders and territories in terms of previous things that we've done. Because actually the cosmodrome's sited in Kazakhstan, but it actually was Russian built and Russian, developed. But of course with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they sold it off. And so they're renting it from the Kazakh people. So it's essentially this piece of Russian land that's been rented in Kazakhstan.
Well, you're also in a fantastic building that also has this kind of history. And it's very dramatically staged. You fill an entire room. And it's something that, like all your work, but it's very, very physical. You know, as you walk past, you become involved in this thing. And there's a kind of sense of, well, it's slightly unnerving. I thought the rocket was sort of coming out at me. I wasn't kind of aware of what was happening. So there's always this drama. Now, how specific were you able to be with the space that you were working in?
I think when it came to showing something like a 35mm projection, putting it to the scale that it is, and also because it's a 4-screen, it's a split as well, it works very well at that scale. And I think the physical quality to it, the nature of seeing a rocket launch is pretty physical, so it's something we wanted to bring through in how it was edited and certainly in the sound. So I think that's something that's very much more, it's more like a sculptural experience, yeah. I guess.
You've shown in galleries all over the world. What's it like to be showing in a space like this in your hometown? Does it mean anything different?
Well, I think it means, what's really excellent is that obviously there's a new contemporary art space opened up here now, which has been long overdue in some respects, because of course there's been great art colleges and, great at the university, and both Northumbria and Newcastle University, fantastic artist programs, but now there's actually a venue that's sort of showing international artists, which is great.
Does this feel like a significant departure for Newcastle and Gateshead, or do you think it's part of a cumulative movement? People are calling it a renaissance, but is this a big deal, or just the inevitable consequence of what's just been happening?
I think it's a big deal, because I think it's a big deal in terms of, certainly in the art world, because there's not many sort of spaces to this scale, or museum spaces this scale, that are showing an entirely contemporary art program, which I think is a big shift in a way.
Yeah.
And commissioning works alongside.
And having studios and, editing facilities and whatever.
It's kind of unique in a way.
Well, that's what interests me, this idea that you can make stuff inside the building. Now, this film, Dreamtime, you've brought from another space, but what about the idea of actually creating something special for the building? Is that likely to happen?
Yes, that's what's going to be happening next year. So that's.
So they've already signed you up. The Baltic's already got you working on another project.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And can we hear anything more about that project, or is it still in kind of gestation?
We'll talk about it when it's there.
Okay.
Yes.
We won't be hostage to fortune. Well, one piece at the moment's enough.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great news.
Great.
Well, we look forward to seeing that.
Thank you.
Jane and Louise, thank you very much.
You.
Thank you. Now, not aside with Jane and Louise, there's also numerous other artists showing in the space at the moment, from the Belgian light maestro Karsten Holler to the cultish American Chris Burden to Julian Opie, one of the leading figures in British art over the last 15 years. He's littered the building and beyond with a series of familiar black outlined images on every conceivable surface. Julian, there's a kind of figurative family dotted around this gallery. How do we read it? How do we experience it?
Well, physically, I hope, and in terms of time, you'll be coming across the bridge, I assume, or possibly down the road, and come across the first two figures that span the time. And then you'll be on Baltic Square and see the next two figures that are up in the viewing box. And then you'll experience some other parts of the museum. And when you do arrive on this floor, it'll probably be through the lift. So when I make an exhibition, it's a matter of predicting, in a way, the experience of the viewer and trying to play back to that, talk to the person that you imagine coming through. So I took that journey and took photographs of that journey a few months ago. And then I've been back in London getting people to pose in the positions that would fit those spaces. And the project's kind of grown. The floor was something that came up as a possibility rather later on, and I just sent an email and said, would you mind if I painted all over your floor? And they said, no, that would be fine.
There's something very discreet about the work, but at the same time it hijacks you. I mean, you have to think very carefully about where you walk on the floor piece. Obviously you can walk on it, but at the same time you can make a conscious decision to play some kind of hopscotch and avoid touching the lines, because we've all been brought up not to walk on works of art or touch them. It's a kind of sacred convention. Now, there's always this discussion about whether works of art should confront the viewer or whether there's something that should just slowly seep into consciousness. That's territory that you've already touched upon, but it seems to me that you're looking at both those kind of ideas.
Well, I have been working on this space for a few years now, not so much as an artist, but as an advisor on a panel. So I do know the space quite intimately, and that's probably had an effect and encouraged me to be more interactive in a sense. And my first, the first idea for my inclusion was really to be outside, only with some signs and maybe with the bridge. And this part of the exhibition has kind of grown, and in fact my first plan that I suggested was really to deal with these two walls. But as I started looking at my photographs and thinking about how I was going to do it, I really wanted to spread out and use other parts, so the library came next. I then thought about the box, and in fact the figures on the floor really came out of the fact that I needed to draw some people specifically for this project. I couldn't use drawings I already had because of the positions that they're in. So when I had the models there, then we started kind of coming up with other possibilities, and I started photographing a lot of other positions, and this floor idea came up as a possibility. There's hardly anything in this room, but on the other hand it's quite full, so it's a reflection on the architecture rather than trying to take your attention away from it. The floor is new territory for me, but it's always very exciting when you find new territory, and I try to use exhibitions not as a place to show finished ideas, but as an opportunity to work, really.
I think that's very interesting that you were on the panel, so there's an artist, a director, and an architect, traditionally in some kind of opposition, and yet a broad consensus broke out. I wonder whether you think this is a kind of new model, really, for the way that arts institutions like this should be built.
There's a certain sense in which the three of us, which was Suna Norgren and Dominic Williams and myself, it was mostly us three talking, the architect, the director, and myself, were moderately like-minded on a lot of points. So we talked a lot about floors, we talked a lot about lighting, a lot about that roof. But I think it's quite important and makes sense, not particularly for me to be on these committees, but for there to be artists on committees. You see so many museums that are designed with elements that are so difficult for artists to use. You know, classically the huge staircase that comes right down into the space, the curved wall, the carpeted floor, too many spotlights hanging down all over the place. And all these things, when an artist comes in and sees them, nearly all of them, their hearts will sink. And you think, well, you know, if they had been involved earlier on, perhaps that could have been avoided. But very often I think architects have an idea, perhaps, about what artists might like or what might look good with a traditional sculpture on a plinth in the middle, but maybe haven't really thought through what's actually going to be shown there.
Upstairs, in the largest space at Baltic, is the American artist Chris Burden, who launched his career in the late 60s with dramatic performances involving cars and guns, but who's since begun to build things that seem a little more playful. Is this children's Meccano? Is this stuff I could go and buy in the shops?
Well, it appears to be, but in fact it's not. It uses the same hole spacing, but all the parts are made to our specification. So if we need a plate this many holes long, we had that made.
If I tried to crawl across this, would it hold me?
I don't know. You have to write me a check first, though.
This priceless piece is, in fact, a scaled-down replica of the Tyne Bridge. It's very curious what this does to your own sense of scale and your own body, because, you know, looking at Meccano models, normally you feel like a giant. And in a way, I still feel slightly Lilliput-like. I'm looking down at this. It's quite disorienting to your own body, I think.
Yeah. Well, I like this size. It's bigger than human, but still kind of comprehensible. It's kind of a sexy size.
Burden's artistic interest in bridges spans over 3 decades, and he's created an ongoing series of which the Tyne is the latest part. It's such an icon, this bridge. I wonder whether you've had any reaction from the locals who think it's a bit cheeky to take their bridge.
I think it's just a unique opportunity. I don't think I'll ever have this opportunity again in my life to make a model of a bridge that you can see the actual bridge right behind it. I mean, you know, you'd think maybe the Sydney Harbour Bridge or maybe one of the Golden Gate, but unfortunately none of the art galleries have windows that face them, so I think this is a one and only chance.
You're an artist, whether it's a reputation you want to be saddled with or not, who is always known as the man who shot himself and did violent things to himself.
I didn't shoot myself. Somebody else shot me. I was the victim, by the way.
Sorry, who had himself shot. Very important distinction. And yet here you are building scale and replica bridges from children's books or from books of bridges, as well as one you can see out the window. And people then think, well, how on earth does that relate to the more visceral or bodily practices of Chris Burden in the 60s and 70s?
The shoot performance was about thinking, imagining rather, the unthinkable, and then actually executing them. And I think in the same way the Tyne Bridge is that, because if you open up a small box of metal, you could imagine building something like that, but it's really unthinkable. And to actually do it.
What about the idea of playfulness and child's play?
This is what a child's dream is when they start off. This is their imagination. But of course, they don't have the skills or the financial resources to execute that. So children's imaginations are boundless in a certain sense. I like the idea of taking this thing that's basically a child's toy and then conflating it. It makes all things seem possible.
Chris Burden's is the big showpiece at Baltic, but no less important are the various studios created for artists in residence, including Scotsman Alec Finlay, who's breaking down the boundaries between art and just about everything else.
This piece is football, as dance, as art, as poetry, as photography, and it never rests entirely in any one of those things. It came about through a couple of projects where I was interested in the relationship between language and experience, a very classic thing. You know, I've been working with poetry a lot, so obviously letters, words, speaking, performance. But I've always loved music without being able to read it. And I realized that there must also be a way of writing down physical movement. And there is, and it's called Laban notation. It was invented by Rudolf Laban earlier in the 20th century. And he not only invented it for artistic movement, for dance, but also for analyzing any human motion. He knew that if you could write it down, you could find a way of analyzing it, and therefore, in a sense, changing it.
And equipped with a new understanding of how to notate human movement, Finlay applied it to an heroic moment in Scottish sporting history, Archie Gemmell's goal against Holland in the 1978 World Cup finals.
Good play by Gemmell, and again. 3-1!
I was between primary school and high school when it happened. It was the first World Cup that I really remember. And I saw it on a black and white TV through a kind of haze, which was partly, you know, that paper that all the Argentinians were always throwing at the matches. Yeah. But it was also a really bad TV. And the other thing I always remember about that World Cup is it had really interesting camera point of view.
Very high up.
You were very high up. And it was the first time that I remember being aware of that in television full stop. So I had this very strange point of view going on. And Scotland had a disastrous World Cup, as everyone knows, but they had this beautiful 55 seconds where this player, who had been a rather unremarkable, tough little, typical Scottish midfielder, scored a goal of outstanding beauty.
A brilliant individual goal by this hard little professional.
So we notated the goal. I got the Gavin Centre in London to notate it, and the notation is very beautiful. And they had to invent a sign for the ball moving along, and then at a certain point the ball stops in the net, and the rest of the notation is the sort of famous celebration that Gemmell did with his little gritty air punch.
Your way of working, of blurring the distinction between different areas of cultural disciplines, actually is what's happening in the most interesting art all over the place. But nonetheless, certain institutions think it's a kind of violation. How has it been working with the Baltic in this way?
I found, to be honest, Baltic absolutely wonderful to work with, because that's the core philosophy. And I think one of the most interesting things listening to Suna is that he doesn't always say the easiest things. Like, he doesn't say we're going to be all about massive visitor numbers. He's very clear. This space is primarily for the producing and experiencing of art. And he seems to marry those two things. And he really means it. The great lie of contemporary culture is authorship. This kind of notion of the sole genius. It does exist, it is important, but equally work is made in the space between people. And that's certainly the way I always experience art.
The Baltic's looking even further afield than dance and professional football, to Cuba no less, and to a young trio with a burgeoning international reputation who go by the name of Los Carpenters, or the Carpenters. Marcus. So I go, Alex. Los Carpenters.
Los Carpenters.
You make things, and looking at the drawings that are on the walls here, they look like buildings to begin with, but actually it's furniture, so the idea of sawing and cutting and building things together is not too far away. So you come for a month, you're here for the opening, but in fact the idea is to degenerate some ideas, and then you come back in a year. What kind of things are you thinking of building?
Well, actually we are thinking create this a downtown. We don't have a title already for the piece, but it's about to create buildings are at the same time as our furniture, and are based on real buildings where we are also inventing new buildings or new furnitures, you know, so it's like.
So you're going to build a cluster of buildings or furniture in one of the galleries then?
Exactly.
One of the things you must always come up against as Cuban artists is that people in the West look for political content. And I found myself doing that in your work. And then with the references to the Russian embassy, I'm still not sure whether there is anything. Are you interested at all in politics in your art?
The fact that we're using the Russian embassy is more because the sculptural looking of the building more than the Russian issue. Actually, it's a sword in the air. When you see the shape of the building.
And especially it's a building that in Cuba no one pays attention to that building, so we are interested in that building. You know?
Yeah. You've travelled a lot, you've made work in different countries, in different museums and exhibitions. I just wonder what you find in a place like this, because it seems to me perfect for you, because it's a factory, it's a place where art is produced as well as a place where art is shown.
How they call it, you know, our factory.
Do you think that this is perhaps a model for the way that more art museums and institutions might work in the future, or have you experienced this all over the world?
No, not really. This is a very new experience for us, and I think it's not something that you find in other places. I mean, this is not a common thing. This is something very unique in a way.
This is a very comfortable place for artists. I think they think when they designed the idea of this institution, they thought about what an artist needs or what an artwork needs. You know, there is some other museum, they are very glamorous and very beautiful, but it's very uncomfortable. I mean, the program is not as great like this place. This place has a lot of social preoccupations and
connections.
And connections, exactly.
That's interesting, because artists were involved in helping to plan this, and it sounds, from your experience, as if that shows.
Yeah, and also, for example, the fact that they are not like, they don't collect art gives like a different sense to this institution, you know. It's something like to artists to come and then go, you know. It's like a place, you know, it's a factory. In a way,
not a museum.
Not a museum.
Well, that's the view from Cuba, but what about the view from downtown Newcastle or downtown Gateshead? Obviously, St James's Park is never going to be superseded as the monument-cum-shrine in this part of the world. But Baltic is certainly getting the local vote. And, to test the cultural climate, rather than send an outsider like me to find out, we asked native-born comedian Gavin Webster to do the business.
So good evening anyway, if anybody hasn't seen me before, my name's Gavin, I'm your compere, I'm from America. First it was the angel that gave us Geordie's wings. Now, there's Baltic, a modern art factory that's intended to become a new source of cultural pride on the Tyne. When I was growing up here, the North East was associated with conceptual art in about the same way that Anne Widdecombe is associated with 110-metre hurdling. Now, apparently, every Geordie is a fully paid-up member of the Damien Hirst Appreciation Society. But is it true that in homes across the North East, where once stood chrome-plated candelabras, mantelpieces now have scaled-down water tanks with a shark infestation problem? When they rise from their beds each morning, do today's Geordies see their dishevelled duvets as an aesthetic statement in the idiom of Tracy Emin? Have Geordies really taken conceptual art to their hearts? They got that angel thing, right? They got the angel, didn't they? And they asked the people in Low Fell what they thought. Some bloke, I kid you not, on the North East News, he says,
well, I would have preferred it if they'd had some female and male threads in the ground and it could have turned round like a weathercock so it would have been a little bit of use to everybody.
Hello, I'm Gavin.
Hello, Gavin, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Chris.
Chris. Chris, can I ask you, you know the Baltic?
Yes.
Are you going?
Yes.
You're going to go? What, to the opening?
Yeah, my wife and I are going.
You and your wife? Are you a fan of modern art yourself?
No, my wife's the art fan. I like bits of it, but not all of it.
Well, you just
go and have a
kinda-
look. I'm taking an interest in it.
Do you think it's an awful lot of money to be spent on
It is a lot
what
of
is
money.
an art gallery?
Yeah, it's a lot of money, but I think it's a lot of money that's needed to be spent on this area, particularly the Gateshead side of the area. It's going to uplift the whole place. We've got clubs, pubs, everything else, but a proper centre for the arts and music.
No, Chris, can you give me a lift round town?
Yeah, jump in.
Excellent, thank you. Gateshead getting themselves an art gallery for £46 million, right? That's a bit like Gateshead getting an art gallery for £46 million, isn't it? You know what I mean? I'm off to meet some other people in Tyneside to see what they think about Baltic. First stop, a local school, where a group of school kids have been working with one of Baltic's artists in residence on a piece of dance based on football. The dance is going to be performed at the opening of Baltic. I'm with Jordan and Phil, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you actually football fans?
Yeah.
You are?
Got us into this.
Who do you support?
Newcastle.
Yeah, good, that's the same as me. Can I ask you, Phil, as a lad, were you interested, be honest here, were you interested in dance before you did this?
Not at all. Well, I got into it for the football side of it, and then I kind of turned it into dance without us realising it. And it's been quite fun actually, so didn't mind the dance at all.
Have you ever been to an art gallery before?
Never. No.
Before you did this, what would you associate with art?
Drawing.
Drawing
painting,
and that.
Painting. Sculpture. Never realised art would lead to this type of thing.
Are you looking forward to it?
Aye, definitely.
Are you nervous in any way?
Yeah, a bit, because there's going to be loads of people there. We're in a hall and apparently it's just going to be all around the side of the hall full of people, so should be quite a lot of people, a bit scary.
I bet you've never even been to Gateshead before, have you?
No.
Can I ask you both, are you going to carry on dancing when this is finished?
I wouldn't go on dancing as in dance, but I'd definitely do something like this again.
You'd do something like
As long
this
as
again?
if it was involved with football or rugby or any other sport I did.
So we'll have to dig up some more goals from the past, won't we?
Yeah.
Back into the centre of Newcastle now to meet a local performance artist called Topsy. Topsy Qur'et. Top secret. Get it? Tell me a bit about your work.
It's performance work.
Mm-hmm.
And recently I've been working with goats' heads in Gateshead.
What is the link between Goat's Head and Gateshead?
Well, I'd read that the Venerable Bede referred to Gateshead as Goat's Head in some of his writing, and I thought that was a good enough reason to work with the Goat's Head motif. Recently I've been involving an audience in taking part.
Taking part
in wearing the goat's heads.
The goat's heads and the dark glasses.
And the dark glasses, yeah.
And
going on picnics with them, or going on train journeys, or dancing, I think.
Is it art? Come on.
I think it's art. What more do you want?
As a local artist, what do you think of the Baltic?
I think it's fantastically exciting. Big, new international centre. It's just going to be great seeing a whole number of works from all over the place to come here. I think it's really good news.
The most surrealist bunch of hecklers I've ever known in my life, you know what I mean? It's just some Salvador Dali evening, isn't it? Oh, fish, banana hair. Tiger turned into a fish. I'm going for a haircut now. I don't need one, but the BBC's paying for it.
I'll just pop this towel around
Yeah.
your neck.
No problem. So, Michelle, are you, why are you going to the Baltic?
Because I'm quite interested on how they've redone it, and just with me...
What, the flour mill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because my father-in-law used to work there when it was a flour mill. I'd be really interested in seeing what they've done to it.
Have you talked to your clients about it?
I have, yeah. When we've had a conversation about it, I've mentioned if they've heard of the building, and they've heard of it and they thought it was a really good idea.
And what do you expect to see in the building?
Something a bit trendy, but not too over the top.
Do you think it was worth spending all that money on it?
Definitely, because
Yeah.
I know people's going to go and inspect it and have a look and see what it's all about.
Here we are now, finally, at Baltic. Let's see how it goes down with the real people.
I came into it with an open mind because I didn't know what it was like inside. I didn't know what to expect. But really, from the minute you walk through the door, there's something there you're gonna take an interest in. I was told a couple of days ago by a good pal of mine that the inside of the place was a massive open space to make people think. And I think that's exactly what it's doing.
Right.
It's brilliant.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Excellent. What do you particularly like about it?
The gongs. The gongs.
The gongs, right. Well, just letting off steam by gonging the gongs.
Give them a good bash.
Uh-huh. Were you surprised when you saw the gongs? Do you think that there would be anything there like that?
Well, we're told that we're going to go and see a gong. We didn't tell we were going to go and see 30 of them.
Oh, it was the 30 altogether,
Well,
was there?
20 or 30.
20 or
I
30,
think.
yeah. Would you say it was art?
Definitely no. It's got to take somebody with some artistic skill to do this stuff.
It's been a fantastically exciting, enjoyable evening. Building, of course, is star, I think, overall. But a lot of interesting work in here as well, but not too much. Plenty of space and to see the building.
All right, you're kind of in that minimalistic way. There's not too much of it just in your face.
Well, not minimalist. I think the work interacts with the building, so I think it's quite an intelligent thing, knowing that people are coming to see the building as much as the individual art. So the emphasis will be on revealing the building for the first time, and so I think the work does that.
You've been round now. You've had a good look.
Yeah.
What do you think of it?
I think it's really good. Really, really good.
Which particular bits do you think are really good?
I like the lights on the first floor, where you actually stand in the centre of it.
Did you stand in the
Yeah, I
middle?
was
Did you
actually
stand on your
standing.
own, or was there more than one of you?
There was a couple of us just stood. It was
And
really
did you
good, yeah.
collect your thoughts, or did you chat while you were sort of?
No, just stood and looked at it. It was really good.
What do you think it means?
Quite truthfully, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's quite focused, quite peaceful.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean when you're looking at the
Yeah.
lights?
So, there you have it. Everyone seems to love it. As for me, I think it's refreshing to see a new development that isn't a bar, a themed restaurant, or a multiplex. Instead, we've got an escapist cultural playground to lose ourselves in as we please. I asked at the top whether Geordies have taken conceptual art to their hearts. We'll have to wait and see. But at least now, we can boast about it in Benidorm.
God bless you.
I thought Benidorm was a conceptual artwork. Anyway, the man responsible for making Geordies proud over the next few years is the director of Baltic, Suna Norgren. Suna, this area has an extraordinary and singular character. I just wonder, as someone who's travelled and worked throughout Europe, but comes from Sweden, how you found working among the people of Newcastle and Gateshead.
Perfect. I mean, they're very straightforward here, and they say what they feel. And but on the other hand, it's pretty easy to be Scandinavian in this country, because in this part of the country, because there are long traditions of contacts with Scandinavia, like from the Vikings and back.
Anthony Gormley said early on in the evening that to begin with there was an antipathy to the Angel of the North, but now there's a great feeling here. I mean, have you traditionally, this isn't an area that people have associated with the arts? Clearly there is a resurgence now.
I think it's right, but I think that the Angel of the North has paved the way for us in many ways, because there was a kind of antagonism against it, but then people turned their minds and they all love it now, and they've taken to their hearts, and I think it paved the way for Baltic and for lots of other things happening here now.
Okay. You've said that you won't take shows from London. You stick to that, do you? Even if you get a blockbuster?
Yes, we can do our own blockbusters.
Yeah, well, that was my next question. How much pressure are you under to have a huge blockbuster show financially?
Not very much. I mean, we are very modest with our business plan, as it's called, and we have a sound economy. We don't need to do these kind of things. And on the other hand, we don't have that kind of public as there is in London anyway. So we try to make very interesting exhibitions, very challenging sometimes, beautiful, entertaining. I mean, all these kind of exhibitions that people can expect here. But it's more than that. I mean, as you know, we call it an art factory as well. So it's also a place where you actually can create art from our times here.
So the experimentalism can thrive here, even after 5 years of government funding. When that bid for the Gateshead Newcastle combined City of Culture takes place in 2008, this place will be a major part of that.
I think so. I mean, we will be an up and running institution for 6 years at that time. I think we've made a major contribution to now when the bid is going in, because we can show people that we can do something here as well.
Okay, well that's great. We wish you the very best of luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this is the finale, a light sculpture by the Catalan artist who also brought us the gongs, Jaume Plensa, sending the Baltic up into the stratosphere. There's a real buzz about the Baltic. Everyone I've spoken to has great hopes for the place, and I don't just think that's the result of a party. The feeling is that radical experimentation of a genuine nature can take place here, with the artist given pride of place, and that doesn't always happen in British arts institutions. And so the feeling is that the Baltic is an illuminating vision that deserves to succeed. Good night.